definitely a heavy-hitting panel moderated by the CEO for Value Reporting Foundation, Ms. Janine Guillot. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to hearing from all of you.
Thank you, and welcome. Welcome to everyone. I just want to say that I'm so thrilled to be hosting this panel, which is called The Future of ESG Integration. And usually, and I've moderated a lot of ESG panels through the years, usually I have to start my first question with talking about, well, why is ESG integration important? And what I'm really excited about is that I think we don't really have to have that conversation anymore, that there's now broad understanding that ESG issues impact risk, they impact return, and thinking about how to meaningfully integrate ESG into investment decision-making is an increasingly common practice. So now we can start talking about how increasingly sophisticated ESG integration strategies are, and the data and tools that support ESG integration strategies are rapidly evolving and are increasingly sophisticated. So that's what we really want to talk about today. And I think we have an outstanding panel to do that. I think it'd be really terrific if we could just let everyone introduce themselves briefly and their roles, so you have an understanding of the expertise you're going to hear from today. And I'm going to go in order of my Zoom screen. And first I see Martina.
Thanks, Janine. Great to be here. My name is Martina Cheung. I'm the president of S&P Global Market Intelligence, one of the 4 divisions at S&P, and I'm also responsible for S&P Global Sustainable One, which is our centralized ESG group. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great, thank you. And Nan?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Jenny. So my name is Nan. I head up PIS team in China. So I engage with Chinese investors, policymakers, and regulators to promote and drive responsible investment in China. Thank you.
Terrific. Kyung-Ah?
Hi, it's a pleasure to be joining everybody. And I must say, given this is an ESG event, it's great to be actually on an all-female panel. So I just wanted to note that. So as per the intro, I'm the Managing Director for ESG Investment Management at Temasek. And our team's remit, in essence, is to actually work across our investment teams and across the institution to really harness ESG as a core engine across our global investments. And this entails ESG integration across the investment process. I'm sure we'll be talking about that, as well as ESG-related investment strategies and partnerships.
Great. And Emily?
Thank you, Janine. Hi, I'm the co-head of Sustainable Investing for BlackRock for Asia Pacific. The BlackRock Sustainable Investing team acts as the central authority on sustainable investing for the firm. And it's responsible for 4 main activities that cut across the entire product suite. That includes our dedicated sustainable investing solutions, as well as advancing ESG integration across our whole active platform. Also providing research and insights that are used by the various different investment teams across the organization, as well as building the data and analytics and offerings within our Aladdin technology platform that are being used to inform all of those insights across the firm.
Terrific. So thank you. Thank you all for being here. And I think I'll open up with a question, particularly to Emily and Kyung-Ah, around the question on, if we think about ESG integration, people often talk about it through 3 lenses. ESG considerations in stewardship and or voting decisions, ESG considerations in security selection, if you're talking about public markets, or individual asset selection in the private markets, or then ESG considerations in portfolio construction or asset allocation. And I'd love to hear a bit from each of you about how you think about and how you apply ESG integration through those 3 lenses. And maybe, Emily, I can start with you.
Sure, no problem. So maybe I'll start by talking about stewardship, and then in the interest of time, I'll pass over to Kyung-Ah, who'll talk more about the investment decision making. So at BlackRock Investment Stewardship, it's an essential component of our fiduciary responsibility to help our clients meet their long-term financial goals. And that's particularly important for our index holdings because in those we're very long-term shareholders. And because we're taking this long-term perspective to investments, sustainability is inherently a key part of how we need to engage with the companies that we hold on behalf of our clients. And our conviction is that companies will perform better over the long term when they're deliberate about their roles in society and they act in the interests of their stakeholders. So we're using our voice as a shareholder to urge companies to focus on the important material issues, things like climate change or the fair treatment of workers or gender equality, because we believe that that leads to durable corporate profitability. So each year we're refreshing our engagement priorities and our voting guidelines to focus on the issues that we consider to be top of mind for companies and our clients, obviously, as their shareholders. So this year we mapped our engagement priorities to specific UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we're doing that not because it's the right thing to do, but because our own research finds that advancing the SDGs can actually be financially material to corporate value. So we've been engaging with companies on sustainability for many years, and we're now asking all of our companies to publish SASB and TCFD aligned disclosures, with SASB focusing on all material sustainability issues and TCFD being more climate focused, which is one of our top priorities. And under the TCFD guidelines, that should include the company's plan for operating under a Paris-aligned climate scenario. And given the groundwork that we've already laid in this space and the growing investment risks surrounding sustainability and particularly climate, we've seen that we're increasingly disposed to hold members of the board accountable by voting against their re-election if we believe companies haven't made sufficient progress in these regards. And look, we acknowledge there's varying levels of dependence on carbon in different economies, and especially in Asia, where the corporate dialogue around climate risk and the energy transition is an earlier stage. So when we think about how to engage these companies, it's really critical to ensure that the climate transition, for example, is just and equitable for all. And we're expecting them to take action to reduce their carbon emissions and have credible strategies to address climate risks. So ultimately, we believe that the companies that are critically evaluating those baselines and setting targets and acting with the right amount of urgency are the most likely to do well. And so our engagement activities reflect this conviction as part of our fiduciary duty. So maybe I'll stop there and I'll pass over to Kyung-Ah to talk a bit more about the investment side of things.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So before I pick it up and address the crux of Janine's question, let me just step back and give a very quick picture of Temasek's portfolio so you can have a context for how we do the ESG integration. So we have a very diverse portfolio, about 380 billion Sing dollars, and it cuts across not only different geographies as well as different industry sectors, but also private and public assets, as well as early stage all the way through investments in large mature incumbents. We're primarily a direct equity investor, but we also do targeted investments in funds, platforms, as well as partnerships, and then investments in credit and liquid assets. So ESG for us is not a one-size-fits-all. It very much focuses on what are the material risks and opportunities that we really have to manage for so we can build a long-term resilient portfolio that really generates long-term sustainable value. And that's really critical for us, given that we are a long-term generational investor. So with that as a context, coming back to Janine, your kind of three lenses, just very quickly. So first, in portfolio construction, we actually align a portfolio to key structural trends. It's actually 4 of them, where we believe that there's really strong tailwinds for growth, as well as solutions that really address global challenges that we collectively have to lean into. And one of the key trends is sustainable living. It's actually a cross-cutting trend alongside digitization that touches pretty much all industries and markets, where there's very, very strong policy push and market pull, and an area where we are focusing on really increasing ambition around. Second, related to this, we actually have a target to decarbonize our portfolio. In fact, by 2030, halving our portfolio emissions from a 2010 baseline on the pathway towards a net zero by 2050, if not earlier. In meeting that target, we are actually investing into innovative technologies that drive and scale carbon reduction and removal solutions. In addition, very importantly, we are engaging with our portfolio companies and helping them transition including in heavy emitting sectors as well. And this is through both one-on-one engagement, but importantly, we are curating and facilitating ecosystem and networks where companies can share best practices. And in some cases, also partnerships, particularly in hard to abate sectors. I think many of you have heard throughout the panels, for example, sustainable aviation fuel, as well as maritime decarbonization. And then lastly, when it comes to new investments and new assets, all of our investments that come to investment committee have to do ESG analysis. In fact, we have a ESG template where we have cross-cutting set of issues where each of the deals have to look at carbon and climate, outside in ESG rating perspective, as well as reputation exposure, alongside that bespoke material issues that are very much dependent on a deal, as well as a given sector and an industry. And so these all collectively drive ESG integration and make sure that we are keeping a lens on the long-term resiliency and sustainable value creation of our portfolio.
That's
so
really interesting. Yeah, that is so helpful. Very, very interesting, and particularly the way you build the portfolio around those themes. That is really interesting to learn more about. Nan, can you talk a bit about China and how is ESG integration different in China? And are there specific ESG issues that investors are focused on in the Chinese market?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Jenny, for the question. So in terms of ESG integration framework and techniques, I would say there's no essential difference between our Chinese signatories and their international peers. Back in 2019, the PI collaborated with the CFA Institute to study the investors' ESG integration practices across different markets. What we found was that the leading Chinese investors are actually adopting high quality ESG integration techniques, which are as advanced as the leading international investors. But generally speaking, ESG integration is still at the very early stage of development. It's minority rather than majority Chinese investors are doing ESG integration. Especially the Chinese mutual fund managers are relatively proactive and also leading the way among the asset management industry. So in the past few years, the market has been building momentum for ESG investing, but it's not a must to have for now. That's also because neither regulators or the Chinese asset owners are requiring or demanding investment managers for ESG integration. So therefore, generally speaking, the level of ESG integration adoption and also the sophistication are basically low. So that's one difference, I would say. In terms of the practices, as I mentioned, they are using similar practices. For example, for investors which are aiming for ESG integration, they work with service providers to establish their internal ESG database and rating methodologies for assessing ESG performances and incorporate ESG information into, the listed companies analysis and also into the credit analysis. And also, they also do engagement with companies. But the second difference is on engagement. As people might know, stewardship or engagement, this concept is still very new in China. It's becoming a new practice by the leading investors, with investors, for example, joining the global engagement initiative called Climate Action 100+. So they are learning the collaborative engagement practice, but still there are big challenges which need to be overcome. For example, there's a lack of engagement culture in China, and also there are lack of sufficient incentive for investors to do collaborative engagement. And when it comes to the ESG issues, so colleagues talked about climate change, as now China has announced the carbon neutrality goal by 2060. So since the announcement, climate change has been becoming a material factor for Chinese investors. So they are catching up with this global trend. But still, I think they are still at early stage. For example, there hasn't been many investors which have done the TCFD reporting. One dimension which is different is the social issues, as people could easily understand. In China, on the social issues, the investors have been supporting the country's poverty alleviation as their priority as part of their ESG framework. But in contrast, the international topics, the social topics such as diversity, inclusion, and equity, those social topics are still very advanced in China. So that's briefly what I see the differences in China.
Thank you. That's really interesting and actually sets up a fantastic question for Martina, which is everything that the investors want to and need to do relies on strong, robust, comparable, reliable data. And I'd love to hear your perspective, Martina, on what you think the current state of ESG data is, and what are your clients' priorities about ESG data? And then maybe you can also build in a little bit of thinking about the S data, which we find with the SASB standards, one of the actually measuring diversity and inclusion on a global basis is one of the more challenging things. So sorry, Martina, I hate to throw you 3 questions in one.
No problem. Thanks, Janine. Actually, pivoting off something that Nan mentioned, I do think that we are at a critical juncture here, and it's not just because of the evidence that we see of climate change and extreme climate risk, but it is also because of the number and increasing volume of regulations that we're seeing globally. So many of you will be deeply intimate with the SFDR regulation, the EU taxonomy, and CSRD that has recently been published also. And against this backdrop, we also have many of the largest asset managers and asset owners in the world who have signed up to the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance, Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, GFANZ, the alphabet soup of all these commitments around ESG. And so that is really encouraging and increasing the demand for what we would characterize as evidence-based insights, and increased demand for high quality data and analytics to enable decision making and to be able to actually link a company's ESG performance with their actual business performance. Which gets to this concept of materiality that I think Kyung-Ah and Emily referenced. So the challenge, of course, as Janine says, is really around the data and the state of the data. There are a few things that I would mention relative to that. The first is that a lot of this data will be hard to come by. And so one of the key areas that we hear quite a bit from our clients is on Scope 3 emissions and the availability of data to be able to model that with a high degree of accuracy. Once you start getting into supply chains, you get into mid-sized companies, smaller companies, and the difficulty, of course, of accessing that data becomes quite evident. Another area that we see pivoting off that is, in fact, the lack of information that might exist on non-listed companies or private companies. And here we see the private markets space, in particular private equity, beginning to really step up and get more involved, but more certainly needs to be done here for smaller companies also. And I would say perhaps one of the other points to make on this, which is very important, is that we have long commitments. So we have companies making commitments to 2040, to 2050 and 2060, of course, as Nan mentioned. And that presents an issue because we have lots of historical data. What we don't necessarily have against these long-term commitments would be a set of near-term or immediate information. against those. So the challenge really is to disclose early, to track and to report against that, and that's something that we're hearing quite a bit from our clients. To your point and question on the social factors, this is absolutely increasing in importance. We conduct a corporate sustainability assessment, Janine, which I think you're familiar with, annually, and we actually have seen this year an increase of about 50% in the companies that want to engage with us and report against our corporate sustainability questions. And we ask about 100 questions. We collect over 1,000 data points. We now have 5 out of those 100 questions specifically addressing gender, for example. An additional 4 questions have gender overlays, so about 9 out of the 100. And we're continuing to increase that because we're seeing and getting the interest from the market in this. So most definitely, the interest comes in around board and management diversity, comes in around health and safety practices, labor practices, etc. But there's another factor which we're seeing becoming a topic of great interest, and that is employee well-being. And we at S&P Global are working with an organization called the World Wellbeing Movement that is very focused on this right now. And there are some there who would say, that well-being for employees could actually become the sort of the GHG protocol, if you like, the equivalent of GHG to E, as employee well-being would be to S. So this is something that we're investigating closely and beginning to conduct some research in partnership with the World Wellbeing Movement. Some more to come on that.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. At SASB, on the SASB standards, we have a major human capital research project underway, and well-being is one of the issues that surfaced, and especially around mental health, which is a very interesting, especially through the pandemic and the impact on mental health. So I'm going to go to Emily and Kyung-Ah and ask you for your views on data, since you are having to use data every day. Interestingly, both of your organizations are members of the SASB Standards Investor Advisory Group. And I'd really love to answer 2 questions. Why are you members of the Investor Advisory Group? And what is your view on the current state of ESG data? And maybe I can start, Emily, with you.
Sure, thanks, Janine. Well, look, there is an abundance of data out there, and ESG data is very useful as long as you actually understand what it is and you know what you want to do with it. And that's the key reason why BlackRock is investing in the development of our sustainable data and analytics, because it enables us to generate sound investment insights from ESG issues that we believe may not be priced into the market yet. And just to reiterate a point that Martina made, for example, it's possible for us to collect something like 3,000 ESG data points on each company that we look at. But from our research, we find that only around 20% of those data points actually will materially affect financial performance. And one of the key sources of those insights are company disclosures. So assessing sustainability risks and opportunities, it requires that investors have access to that consistent, high quality and material public information. So for us, the SASB framework is actually the only global and sector-specific framework that focuses on that financial materiality. And the reason that's important is because a focus on financial materiality allows us to do an evaluation by sector. And it recognizes that issues that are most relevant for an information technology company, for example, are going to be different to those for an industrial company. And so we find SASB to be a very helpful framework for companies to start reporting towards, that's not overly prescriptive, but still provides companies with a template to think about and manage their material sustainability risks and opportunities. And so that's why we're asking all of our companies to report in alignment with SASB now. We're actually really encouraged by the progress that we've seen on this, particularly over the past year. Something like a 360% increase in SASB disclosures in 2020, which is fantastic, and particularly good traction in APAC, actually, even though that was coming from a low base. So we may still have a long way to go, but actually we're seeing that all moving in the right direction.
Terrific. And Kyung-Ah, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, so let me jump in and just underscore, right? ESG data is really foundational to investors in understanding the material risk and opportunities and getting a holistic picture of how a company is really managing for these, right? So in many ways, it's a lifeblood. And I think it's fair to say that we've made a lot of progress thanks to SASB as well as TCFD and other voluntary efforts and through investor engagement and some of the stakeholder engagement. But I come back to some of the points that the fellow panelists have mentioned around the challenges, right? And also the Minister of Finance articulated very well this morning in terms of the need to actually get high quality data that is comparable, consistent, and also timely, right? And you used examples of scope 3 challenges in greenhouse gas emissions. Once you start moving to other E dimensions like biodiversity or water, it's highly localized. And then you talked about S dimensions and how it's highly nuanced across different cultures, as well as, arguably some of the values-driven approaches and interpretations to this, right? So we still have a fair amount of work to do. And the minister articulated what are the key ingredients really well. And just to underscore for those of you who may have missed it, he talked about the global standardization and interoperability requirements, certainly around taxonomy, but also in terms of the actual, standards themselves. And IFRS and the Sustainable Standards Board is a great example of the efforts that are underway that is building off of existing efforts such as SASB, TCFD, CDP, and so on. And I think that's a great development. Ensuring reliable, verifiable, and transparent data that also has some level of assurance around the material aspects of data, I think is also a must. And then we need a stronger impetus for disclosure, right? And that also means voluntary efforts are great, but we need some mandatory disclosure, particularly around, again, what are the most financially material information that investors in the market really need to make some of these key decisions. And then lastly, the availability and accessibility of ESG data and the technology-driven platform that the minister articulated as well. I think those are all key ingredients. And coming back to SASB, so again, the materiality component is very important. And we actually do have ESG frameworks that we equip our investment teams with. And that is actually very much driven by and developed using the ESG materiality map of SASB. And when we look at what SASB is doing, we're part of the IAG, the advisory group. It's actually great to learn from, but also contribute to enhancing ongoing sustainability standards and also being able to drive higher quality disclosure in more nascent markets like Asia. So it's been a great partnership in many ways, Janine.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That's terrific. And thanks to both of you. And to Emily's point about the rapid growth and adoption of the SASB standards globally, it's been largely due to investors like both of you. So really a terrific partnership. I want to transition and talk about climate specifically. But several of you have referenced the net zero commitments and the commitments of asset owners and asset managers to achieve Paris-aligned or better portfolios. And I'd really like to talk about what that means in practice and what strategies you're looking at to achieve that. And so Kyung-Ah, maybe we can start with you, because I'd love to hear how you think about what are you going to do in your portfolio to achieve that commitment.
Yeah, so let me start with the 2030 target. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a commitment to halve our portfolio emissions by 2030 from a 2010 baseline. And it's actually a very ambitious goal in light of the fact that our portfolio continues to grow. And we actually have investments, given we are a long-term investor in companies that are in hard-to-abate sectors and in carbon-intense sectors. So there is no silver bullet. We have to take a multifaceted approach and do the hard work. And so to give you some examples of what we're doing, and I'll talk about 3 key levers in particular. First is we are investing into climate-aligned opportunities that really scale decarbonization. And these range from direct investments into, for example, clean energy companies that are scaling solar, or even innovative closed-loop geothermal, as well as hydrogen. And outside of the energy sector, hard-to-abate areas as well, and innovative solutions such as bio-based green chemicals, green cement, as well as in alternative proteins, and the list can go on, but you get the gist. We also are have strategic partnerships where we can actually crowd in additional capital and bring our respective synergies to really accelerate the net zero pathway. So Decarbonization Partners joint venture with BlackRock, thank you, Emily, is a good example of this, where we are going to be launching a series of funds in the late venture early growth stage to really scale up innovative decarbonization technologies. The second lever is enabling negative carbon solutions. And this range from technologies that are really taking carbon from the atmosphere, so direct air capture. For example, we're investing in Savante, as well as importantly, nature-based solutions. These are projects, for example, in the wetlands, forestry, and so on. And there was actually a great discussion on this yesterday, talking about the opportunities, particularly in Asia. And they have many co-benefits around biodiversity as well as community benefits in addition to carbon. So we're investing into projects and facilitating the ecosystem. Again, many people talked about the challenges of our voluntary market today, given it's highly fragmented and nascent. And so we need to, alongside the projects, really be able to build the platforms and marketplaces and really build the ecosystem around that. So Climate Impact X is another good example of that. And then lastly, coming back to where I started, portfolio company engagement. We absolutely have to work with our portfolio companies, share best practices, and help them on their transition pathway as well. And the prior panel had Semcor, which is a portfolio company, and that's a great example of how portfolio companies are increasing their own ambitions and really increasing renewable energy and transitioning to sustainable solutions. So that's sort of in a nutshell, the different levers that we're harnessing.
So that's very interesting. And I think what's really interesting is how much flexibility you have around your portfolio. And I'd love to hear from Emily and Martina what you see with your clients who are managing large, more index-oriented portfolios, and how are they thinking about these decarbonization targets in the context of more index or rules-based portfolios? Would love to hear your thoughts on that. Maybe, Emily, we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Janine. Yeah, as an asset manager, the questions we get most often right now are around how our clients can navigate the low carbon transition and incorporate those risks into their portfolios. So we're committed to helping our clients do that to support the goal of net zero by 2050 or sooner. So the way that we're doing that is taking several steps, as Kyung-Ah said, along a multifaceted approach to help prepare investors for that. So the first of those is our investment stewardship efforts, and I touched on those earlier, so I won't go into that in depth again. But the other two main lenses that we're looking to incorporate that is one is through enhanced measurement and transparency, because that helps our clients make the right choices for them in terms of what works for their needs. And then the second being expanding the breadth and depth of the climate investment strategies to actually be able to offer them those choices. So just to give you examples of how that actually plays out through some of the commitments that we've made. On the measurement and transparency side for 2021, we committed to a few things. The first of which was that we would be publishing a temperature alignment metric for our public strategies in the markets that we have sufficiently reliable data to do so. But that helps clients understand the trajectory that the portfolios they're invested in is on. The second lever being kind of publishing the proportion of our AUM that's currently aligned to net zero, as well as announcing a target, an interim 2030 target on the proportion of AUM that will be aligned to net zero by 2030. But also through our data and analytics capabilities, helping our clients manage and meet their objectives by tracking their investment performance as well as trajectories towards net zero. So that's on the measurement and transparency side. But then on the investment management side, we also committed to incorporating the impacts of climate change into our top-down capital market assumptions. And that helps as the cornerstone for portfolio construction at BlackRock. We also have a heightened scrutiny model across our active portfolios as a framework to help clients understand and manage the securities that pose quite significant climate risk. And then to Kyung-Ah's point, on the actual product and solution side, helping clients benefit from the actual opportunities that could be created by the energy transition, and the initiative that Kyung-Ah mentioned is one of those examples. And that's everything from investments in electric cars to clean energy to energy efficient housing. And then on the other side of that, there's also solutions that have explicit temperature alignment goals, including products that may be aligned to a net zero pathway. So it's about offering that transparency and choice to our clients to help empower them to make the right decisions for them.
That's so interesting, and especially the bit about the capital markets assumptions. I wish we had about 10 more minutes to talk about that. But I'm going to kick it to Martina, because I'd love to hear, Martina, what you're doing in tools and analytics for your clients around helping them model their portfolios.
Yeah, just to highlight the importance of this ability for investors who are looking at index strategies. A couple of our fastest growing indices in this area are Paris-aligned climate-themed index and our Global Clean Energy Index. So those are two that we've seen really strong growth in over the last couple of years, and we're continuing to look at developing further in thematic indices around climate. I would also say, Janine, that we're seeing high demand for tools and analytics that allow us to take the data that we have that covers about 15,000 companies and allow many of our clients to examine their portfolios for SFDR reporting, for example, to analyze their portfolios against the EU taxonomy as well. And so those are products that we've seen a great deal of interest in from our clients. Beyond that, I think we're seeing quite a bit of interest in what I would characterize as impact and expanding beyond the core climate pieces. So a lot of interest in our SDG analytics on the investment side, but we're also ourselves beginning to really expand out and think about how we think about biodiversity, which Kyung-Ah brought up. And very strong supporters and hotly anticipating the TNFD and looking forward to what we see there.
Okay, terrific. Well, I'm going to go to a couple of audience questions, and I want everyone to know that we got a shout out for loving the all-women panel. So it was noted by our audience. But the question is really about how to make sure that ESG issues are taken seriously at the board level and then integrated and relevant across the entire company. And I think particularly, and maybe Nan, you can take this question, particularly particularly in the context of China, how to think about beginning to engage at the board level and integrate ESG issues into decision making at the board level. And then we could just go to the whole panel on that question.
Yes, thank you for the question. So as I mentioned, ESG investing generally is still at the very early stage. And they are just the leading Chinese investment managers are starting doing ESG integration. And they are setting up the organizational structure for ESG integration. When it comes to incorporate that into the board level, there are companies which, for example, have established a ESG committee, which have the responsibility to supervise the ESG integration work. But I think that's just a very few companies. That's also related to, I think, the TCFD framework adoption. So at the PI, as colleagues might know, since 2018, we have incorporated TCFD indicators into PI's annual reporting framework. And in 2020, we made especially the strategy and governance indicators into mandatory disclosed indicators. So since 2020, we have seen many, thousands of PI signatories which have reported on those data. But talking about China, still very few, because first of all, we still don't have so many investors which have joined PI, although the numbers have been increasing. And also on TCFD adoption, I think generally in China at the moment, the level of awareness on TCFD is still very low. And especially because, the regulators haven't publicly talked about their plan for TCFD aligned regulation either. Nor the Chinese asset owners have said, said to their managers, you have to do TCFD reporting. So generally speaking, actually, I think I don't have much to share. So really, the key will be whether there will be really progress on the regulation side and also on the actions which can be taken by the big Chinese asset owners. But things are progressing, and climate change is now a quite priority for the whole country.
Thank you. And I do think that TCFD 4 pillars are very powerful. They're simple, they're easy to understand, they're in the language that business people use: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And I think those 4 pillars, while developed for climate for TCFD, are equally relevant across all sustainability issues. And I think for boards, particularly, thinking about sustainability through that lens of the TCFD 4 pillars is very valuable. We have only 38 seconds left and we're rapidly counting down. So I want to thank the panel. All of you have been terrific. It was very, very interesting conversation. And to all the attendees, thank you for listening. Thank you for your questions, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.